I thank the Society for asking me to introduce the speaker. Being asked to introduce David Albertson from University of Southern California to this is like being asked to bring coals to Newcastle. A professor of religion at the university, the author of the great work, Medieval Theologies, Nicholas of Cusa, and the Legacy of Theory of Charge. He's going to speak to us this evening on a modern topic with reference to Renaissance Platonism, that is, Genealogy of the Fold, Gilles Deleuze, and Renaissance Platonism. So without further ado, I hand you over to the speaker. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Professor Hackett, for that kind introduction. I am looking at the map and I'm ready to share my slides, but wanted to make sure everything was correct, the right sort of proceeding the right way technically. Should I go ahead?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks for the invitation to speak. I wish I could be there with all of you in person, but I'm grateful for the chance to connect in this new mode that we do. And I wanted to send a special greeting to Professor Duclos and thank him for all of his wonderful scholarship that inspires so many of us. You've never suggested that we should spend more time with French post-structuralists, but that's what I would suggest for today. So, but nothing on you for that. This is entirely my idea. Okay, let me pull up my slides here and we can begin. Okay, can you see the white screen here with the title? Are we good to go?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. What I'd like to present today, I'm calling the Genealogy of the Fold, Gilles Deleuze and Renaissance Platonism or Neoplatonism. And I will jump right in. Here is our subject, and I'll talk about what we'll be just considering here for this talk. For reasons worth contemplating, it seems to me, philosophers have often turned to the writings of Nicholas of Cusa in uncertain times. We can think about Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples in the French Renaissance. We could think of Hermann Cohen and Ernst Cassirer looking for a proto-Kantian in the turn of the 20th century. And I wonder if we too are living through the crest of a Cusan retrieval. Now Nicholas of Cusa not as quintessentially medieval, looking back from the Renaissance, or modern from the early 20th century, but as postmodern. In the 1980s, as we all know, Michel de Certeau's analyses of mystical speech led him to Cusanus. And more recently, Emmanuel Falck and Jean-Luc Marion, to some extent in coordination with our society, have followed the same path in their own meditations on love and iconicity. These last three, Certeau the Jesuit, Falck at the Institute in Paris, and of course Marion, the Ratzinger Prize winner, are all notably Catholic in their orientation. And so they come to the German cardinal as someone as part of their own tradition. The person we're considering today is a different case, Gilles Deleuze, the philosopher. Deleuze, another post-1968 French philosopher, another enthusiastic reader of Nicholas of Cusa, turned to Cusan mystical theology 2 decades before Michel de Certeau, and with equal energy, but in order to pursue an atheistic philosophy and an anti-Platonist philosophy, a strange place to invest if that were one's goals. Deleuze died in 1995 after teaching at the University of Paris 8 at Vincennes Saint-Denis from 1969 to 1987. He was best known for his provocative collaborations with the psychotherapist Félix Guattari that fused Marx and Freud, but he was also in his own right, and he has a whole, many works just written by himself, a redoubtable historian of philosophy, an unusual historian of philosophy, but an impressive one. And he knew what he was doing in medieval Neoplatonism, as I hope to share. Like Foucault and Derrida, Deleuze engaged the tradition carefully and with critical acumen in order to break with it more decisively. But where Foucault studied Christian monasticism And where Derrida turned toward pseudo-Dionysian mysticism, encouraged by Marion, and both relatively late in their careers, Deleuze's views were formed as a student decisively by medieval Christian Neoplatonism, and early enough in his career for the encounter to shape the development of his thought. More so than his fellows in Paris, Deleuze enjoyed a deep familiarity with both Christianity and Platonism. He knew what he was doing in those fields, to whatever ends he was putting them. He discovered in those traditions, he thought, the clearest predication of what he considered to be a false transcendence, one that strangles philosophical freedom and chains human life to a tyrannical one. He wrote 2 books on Nietzsche. It was a very important motivation for him. By strategically deforming Neoplatonism, Deleuze sought to construct a philosophy of pure immanence. Yet ironically, his attack on Christian Neoplatonism ended up demonstrating the ongoing pertinence of distinctively Cusan ideas, above all, the notion of the fold, complicatio and explicatio, enfolding and unfolding. We see it kind of canonically the first place in Nicholas of Cusa, De Docta Ignorantia, Book 2, Chapter 3 is the first place it pops out. And then Nicholas uses it in a variety of ways over 3 decades. I won't be speaking as much about Nicholas here. This is really a paper about what Deleuze found in Nicholas of Cusa and what he did with it, and just really the extent to which I can't think of another 20th century philosopher who was not sort of in Cusanist studies, who knew just so much about Nicholas of Cusa, and yet was putting it paradoxically to an atheistic and anti-Platonic goal, end. Like Derrida, like Foucault, like Jean-François Lyotard and Louis Althusser, Gilles Deleuze benefited from studying under the great Maurice de Condillac, the renowned historian of philosophy and the leading French Cusanist scholar of the post-war period, who died just in 2006. And here's a marvelous picture, 1972, Deleuze, Lyotard, Condillac, Klosowski, and Derrida. So thanks to whoever snapped that photo. Deleuze wrote a dissertation on Spinoza with another professor, Fernand Alquier, famous Spinoza scholar. But Condillac oversaw his more wide-ranging, programmatic second thesis, 1968, on the concept of difference. This is Difference and Repetition, a book about Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, but also exploring the history of philosophy and trying to think a concept of what he calls pure difference without any reference to identity or unity. So the substitute for those latter concepts is repetition. All you can do is temporarily pause or repeat with a difference, pure difference. So it's a work of ontology, among other things. In a 1985 tribute, Deleuze praises his former teacher, and he wishes that others could learn about Nicholas of Cusa from Condillac as he had. We have this great quote. "What a shame," he writes, "that his greatest book, La Philosophie de Nicolas de Cusa, is now so hard to find, not having been reprinted. In its pages, we watch a group of concepts being born, logical and ontological, that will characterize modern philosophy through Leibniz and the German Romantics." So this is relatively late in Deleuze's career, retrospectively acknowledging the influence of Condillac on his own thought and wishing that, in essence, more people read Nicholas of Cusa. Under Condillac's direction, Deleuze read the sources of Christian Neoplatonism. He read Plotinus, and these are all things that he cites later in detail, and he kind of knows where to cite them, perhaps as one of us would, as Professor Duclos would know. Plotinus, Augustine, Dionysius, Eriugena, Bonaventure, Meister Eckhart, Nicholas of Cusa, Giordano Bruno. But as he explains, having read these works, he breaks with his teacher de Condillac by searching for concepts in those authors that militate against a concept of the divine one, contrary to their author's intentions. Deleuze calls these ideas, these opportunities, these concepts, these moments, he calls them zones of immanence. These are concepts that are traces of a univocal ontology within these authors, which in Deleuze's reading break free of the hierarchical theologies of emanation that birthed them. So Deleuze finds these sort of secret moments, he thinks, of possibility of a pure immanence without a hierarchical divine one. And he wants to retrieve those and read them deliberately against the grain as resources for his anti-Platonic project. To think difference immanently without an absolute one requires a non-hierarchical model that can make distinctions without a divine reference point, a kind of lateral differentiation. Deleuze names this figure of thought, this difference without hierarchy, he calls it complication and explication, complicatio et explicatio, consciously invoking the concept of reciprocal folding found in Nicholas of Cusa and before Cusa in Terry of Chartres. In Deleuze's hands, folding becomes a spatial model for immanentizing difference. The transcendent reference of God or the one is no longer required. Instead of seeking out absolute difference vertically, so to speak, Deleuze finds difference laterally and therefore everywhere. So the beauty in his idea is that reciprocal folding, the God enfolds the world and the world unfolds God, but it kind of goes along the same line. These two concepts point to each other and to nothing else. It's sort of pure laterality. And therefore, there's no need for a hierarchical one. The one has been sort of flattened down into the unrolling line of unfolding. And so the fold, he thinks, is a zone of immanence that secures the possibility of a philosophy of pure difference without the one. But he discovers this at Nicholas of Cusa. And to my interest, sort of the maximal moment of intersection between Nicholas of Cusa and the Chartrian in 12th century Paris. One of the greatest things that Nicholas learned from them. So Deleuze's gambit, in a word, is that the fold secularizes Neoplatonism. At least it does in principle, and Deleuze simply wishes to execute it consistently from his point of view. Now, this creative retrieval of folding has captivated the imagination of scholars across the humanities, especially since the English translation of the 1988 book, The Fold by Deleuze. So we'll look at that in a moment. This is his study of Leibniz. Anglophone historians, literary critics, and even process theologians have applied The Fold to various domains of scholarship, but often without the critical attention to the concept's medieval origins that Deleuze knew very well. So it's very common for them to say this is in Leibniz and in Deleuze, and to forget all about poor Nicholas of Cusa and the actual genealogy, which was the starting point for Deleuze was Cusa, not Leibniz. And he knew about Terry of Chartres, and he knew about Boethius, and this is the beginning of his investment starts there. Deleuze could accurately trace, and does, the winding prehistory of enfolding and unfolding from Leibniz and Spinoza to Bruno and Cusanus, and from there to 12th century Neoplatonist commentators on Boethius like Terry of Chartres. This longer genealogy and its theoretical stakes are largely ignored by contemporary exponents of Deleuzian folding, whether their subject matter is critical theory, film studies, medieval history, or theology. And there's a whole conversation we could have about all the ways where this manifests itself in the humanities today. You can go to conferences and see books about the fold, but they usually don't talk about the poor cardinal. But one of the reasons why this is understandable is that this is the fold itself is kind of enfolded upon itself. The genealogy of the concept reflects the shape of the concept. This doesn't always happen. Nicholas found the concept in the 12th century, but the provenance of those sources remained opaque to him, and to some extent still to us, at least until just recently. Because of these gaps in our own reconstruction of the genealogy of the concept of fold, Deleuze aside, Terry of Chartres' innovations and experimentations and inventions of this concept are often conflated with Greek sources that we just know better, that we know of better, like Plotinus. But Terry did not get the concept from Plotinus, and in my view, it's really only fully worked out among 12th century Boethian commentators. On top of that, then Deleuze has multiple versions of it that now I'm going to share with you from the 60s up through the 80s, talking about a variety of topics. And so the fold is enfolded in its own way. Like a nautilus shell, the curve of the fold conceals an interior structure, a trace of its own historical emergence. Okay. I just wanted to share this delightful slide. This is from a video. There's a documentary series that was sort of a series of interviews on television before he died, and it must have been the late 80s, early 90s, and now they're all on YouTube. And they have captioned in English below, and there's one slide where he asks, "What in God's name am I doing here?" Which is an appropriate question for him at our conference here. Okay, so just briefly, really just in a minute, but the concept of the fold I mentioned in Nicholas of Cusa, just to do justice to that, not to do justice to that, but very briefly to mention it. It begins in De Docta Ignorantia in Book 2. He's using at that point several sources. To the best I can understand, he's using some of Terry Shart's commentaries on Boethius de Trinitate, the one that we refer to as Lectiones, which is Terry's most mature version. We don't have any pictures of Terry Shart, so I'm substituting here the sculpture of Pythagoras on the portal of the Chartres Cathedral. Maybe that's what Terry Shart looked like, we can imagine. So Nicholas is using that in Book 2, but there's also a couple strange fragments of ideas about the fold in De Docta Ignorantia 2.3 that don't add up from the sources that Nicholas Herring edited, the big volume of Terry Chart's De Trinitate commentaries. And it seems to be that Nicholas there is demonstrating knowledge of another work by Terry Chart, which we ourselves only discovered, we being Irene Caiazzo, the Italian medievalists in Paris, who just recently, a couple of years ago, produced this beautiful edition of the one manuscript that we have of Terry of Chart's commentary on Boethius's De Arithmetica. And I had been working on this material in detail for several years, and she had published a few extracts in a journal article. Now that we have this in hand, and that the attribution is so thoroughly made and completely persuasive, and it fits like a key in the lock in terms of our other knowledge of Terry's other writings and Nicholas's knowledge of Terry's writings. I think it's very safe to say, and I've made this argument, that Nicholas probably had something like this text. He had Terry Chart's commentary on De Arithmetica, and he works it into his own presentation of the idea of the fold in De Docta Ignorantia. This is a whole other conversation, but you get a sense of even our understanding of what folding is newly clarified. For example, its grounding in arithmetical and geometrical concepts is even more apparent now that we have this new source. So before, it seemed like Nicholas sometimes applies it to God and the world, sometimes applies it to, just kind of all kinds of things. He applies it to, papal power and conciliar power. He uses it all in all kinds of dimensions. And then occasionally he uses it in mathematical ways too. Now we know that Terry, to the best of our knowledge, innovated the concept while encountering the mathematics of Boethius. And that was the first time he invented it. And then Terry of Chart applied it to the divine case, theologically. And then Nicholas applied it in lots of different ways. Deleuze takes this concept back again and again to mathematics. He's very interested in mathematics, writes about mathematics. And there's a great irony in the way that Deleuze is trying to get away from the theological use of folding, and he keeps being pulled back into the mathematical, which is the basis of the theological use among Christian Neoplatonists. So there's this dynamic that I can't get into all of it today, but of him trying to kind of escape, Christian Neoplatonism, but he keeps ending up where they began. Okay. Until recently, this is a website, you can go check it out. Just Google the Deleuze Seminars. It's a great new set of English translations of audio recordings of Deleuze's seminars that were never published, but we did have recordings of. And it's searchable. It's a magnificent web platform, thanks to these faculty members at Purdue University. Until recently, that brief tribute that we read of de Gondiac contain most of what we knew of Deleuze's Cusan encounters. But these newly transcribed archival recordings of his seminars show us that from 1971 to 1987, Deleuze had significant knowledge of Nicholas of Cusa. For example, and I'm just going to run through a couple excerpts here so you can get a flavor of this. Deleuze calls in 1980-81 seminar on Spinoza, he calls Nicholas of Cusa, quote, a very, very important philosopher, a very important man of the Renaissance. In 1980, he handily summarizes on the fly in his course, Divisione Dei, and says, quote, a very interesting, very odd author named Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa. Leibniz knew him well. He had read him extensively. In 1986, Deleuze explains power in Foucault by referencing possessed from De Possessed, Nicholas of Cusa. He says, quote, it's an awful barbarism, but philosophically, it's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Deleuze even knows more obscure passages, and I found references to Idiota de Staticis Experimentis, the pages on planetary astronomy in Book 2 of De Dogma Ignorantia, the aesthetics of the image in De Ludo Globi, the figure of the Idiota in the 1450 dialogues. It's really quite impressive, the depth and breadth of his knowledge. He had an impressive familiarity with Nicholas of Cusa, but the center of his interest remains the fold, complicatio and explicatio. In 1980, for instance, he says, quote, God complicates the subjects in the world. In all of Renaissance philosophy, Deleuze says, complication is undergoing development. It will become one of the most beautiful concepts of Renaissance philosophy, notably in two great philosophers, Nicholas of Cusa and Giordano Bruno. And Deleuze, who had a wicked sense of humor, says in his seminar, Giordano Bruno, who died, burned to death, died complicated by fire. Not a very nice joke. In 1986, he describes explicatio with equal care. Quote, one of the great precursors of classical thought was named Nicholas of Cusa, and the Cardinal of Cusa says, in a very common formulation, God is universal explication. God is universal explication. This can only be understood if you take seriously that to explicate is to unfold, end quote. That's Deleuze in his 1986 seminar. But it matters where one looks. He wrote about folding in particular in a couple of major works that I just want to sort of walk us through so you can get a sense of the depth that he's operating at. And you can also begin to feel the torsion, the deformation that he's working on the Cusan instance of the concept toward his project that's atheistic and anti-Platonic. We're going to go through a couple. One of it is called Proust and Signs, 1964, and I'll have all of these up in just a moment. Spinoza and the Problem of Expression, 1968, the first thesis. Difference and Repetition, the second thesis, 1968. He mentions it in his work on Foucault, which we're going to skip over for time, 1986, and especially the book that only writes in 1988 called The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque. The argument being the Baroque was the period of the aesthetics of the fold in full flower. And he goes into great detail about this. A post-Cartesianism that would need to make use of, as it is in Leibniz, the figure of the fold. But when Deleuze is speaking about it, he's really speaking less about Leibniz. If, for those of us who are read in on the medieval Neoplatonism, it really is a return to that. Our first text, Proust and Signs. Joshua Ramey, an excellent Deleuze scholar who's very good on the historical context, Ramey, has uncovered Deleuze's first allusion to folding. Certain Neoplatonists used a profound word to designate the original state that precedes any development, any explication, complication, which envelops the many in the one and affirms the unity of the multiple. Eternity did not seem to them the absence of change, nor even an extension of a limitless existence, but the complicated state of time itself. And this Latin is Deleuze's. And he doesn't reference it, but we can tell this is from Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy, Book 5. And he just throws in a reference there. Quite impressive. The word, omnia complicans, and containing all essences, was defined as the supreme complication, the complication of contraries, the unstable opposition etc. I won't read the rest of the quote. Interesting to note that, first of all, Deleuze is right on the money about the notion of complectitur and explicatio in Boethius. And the passage that he cites comes from the notion of providence and eternity, eternity and time in Book 5 of the Consolation. But this second reference to the word verbum omnio complicans is a reference to Nicholas of Cusa. That passage never, that equation of the word and omnio complicans never occurs in Terry of Chartres. It's one of Cusa's modifications. And so Deleuze is quite deft in his ability to reference Christian Neoplatonist traditions. But his first sustained explication of folding, besides that first mention, only arrives in the 1968 study of Spinoza. The concept expression in Spinoza's philosophy captures a number of terms, but he comes back again to complicatio and explicatio. And it's in this text that Deleuze begins to make his argument about Christian Neoplatonism. And let me see if I can just I'm just going to summarize and tell you his basic argument. But if you're interested, I highly recommend, it's very easy to find. I think it's chapter 11 in this book, Expressionism in Philosophy, Spinoza. I have some PDF, I guess we're recording, but I have some PDFs in violation of copyright law. If you're interested, just email me and I will send them to you. But in this passage, Deleuze says, emanationism in Christian Neoplatonism is the best zone of immanence to produce an atheistic anti-Platonism as a postmodern philosophy. Why emanation? Because in emanation, we see a moment of God being fully expressed into unfolding. We see the one being kind of fully drained away into the many. And the resulting many is the prototype of what Deleuze wants to construct as a philosophy of pure difference. So the emanation of the many out of the one is the focus of his interest. It's hidden away in this book, but purportedly about Spinoza. But it's really about this pivotal chapter about Christian Neoplatonism. And he goes into detail. He cites Plotinus, and he has footnotes to Bonaventure, and he has footnotes to Eriugena, and he has footnotes to Nicholas of Cusa about the fold. So he says, within the canon of Christian Neoplatonism, these, what he calls pantheistic thinkers, stress the immanence of God within the world, and the pantheism of these thinkers who were censured, he says, triggered a kind of reaction inside the Neoplatonist tradition. The via negativa, the tradition of apophasis, of apophatic theology, is a strategy to retain the supremacy of the one. The reasoning, the via eminentiae of analogy, is an attempt to retain the supremacy of the one. So Deleuze says, in essence, I want the pure emanationism minus negative theology and minus analogy. He says, if you do, and he spells this all out, if you do away with apophatic theology and you do away with analogical participation in the one, the remainder would be a radical pantheism that's tantamount to a purely immanent philosophy of difference without God. So this is the reason for his great investment as a Nietzschean in, of all things, medieval Christian Neoplatonism. Here's the key note where he makes the connections that interest us. Boethius applies to eternal being the terms comprehendere and complectire. The nominal couple, complicatio explicatio, or the adjectivo complectue explicative, take on great importance in Boethius's commentators, notably in the 12th century school of Chartres. But it is above all in Nicholas of Cusa and in Bruno that the notions acquire a rigorous philosophical character. See de Gandillac. To the best of my understanding of this nexus of problems, you could publish that statement today in a journal and you would be up to date. And he's writing this in 1968. So the sort of acumen that he had, thanks to Gandillac, was really remarkably sophisticated and accurate. And after this little genealogy that he provides in this passage, he then cites Nicholas of Cusa, De Docta Ignorantia 2:3. And he says, folding then became a basic category in Renaissance thought. The second instance is in the book of the same year, difference in repetition. In this passage, we can see him pulling away and beginning to give it his own sense. Quote, the trinity of complication, explication, implication, his invention, accounts for the totality of the system, the chaos which contains all, a divergent series which leads out and back in, emanation and return. And this is a technical term in this book, the differentiator which relates them to one another. Each series explicates and develops itself, but in its difference from the other series which it implicates, or which implicate it, which it envelops and which envelop it, in this chaos which complicates everything. The entire book is like that. It's extremely obscure. It's beautiful in some passages, but it's a very challenging book. Moving right along. Folding in the 80s. So these were two texts, both from 1968, the Spinoza text, and the Proust text is from 64, and that last text was from the 68, his second book. 20 years later, Deleuze is still wrestling with Cusanus, like Jacob and the angel. He finished writing The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque, in 1988, his last, but by far most often cited interpretation of folding. But you can see what you would be missing if you only began here. In this project, against Cartesian metaphysics, Deleuze is enthusiastic about Leibnizian references to folding, because this sense of fold denies that matter is merely a collection of minimal points like grains of sand. Rather, he says, instead of parts and wholes and the sort of perfect mechanistic cosmos of Cartesianism, rather, in Leibniz, or Deleuze's version of Leibniz, matter is a play of folds, defined not as points, but as lines. Lines are continuous inflections that precede the points within them. He speaks of the pure event of line that precedes the part, the simple extremity of the line. He refuses to call points points, he calls them point folds with a hyphen. Parts of wholes are simply folds folded into other folds in a kind of radical continuity. Without the fold, the point precedes the line. Within the fold, the line precedes the point. What's remarkable about this, and why I pause here for a moment to emphasize this, if I can go back here and fast forward, that is almost verbatim what Terry of Chartres says in the first instances of his use of the fold as a concept. Unity is the enfolding of number. Number is the unfolding of unity. The point is the enfolding of magnitude. Magnitude is the unfolding of the point. This is the manuscript that Cusa used for that beautiful new volume of Terry of Chartres' commentary on the De Arithmetica. So Deleuze in his Leibniz book ends up, even behind Nicholas of Cusa, even behind our prior knowledge of Terry of Chartres, into texts of Terry of Chartres that we only recently uncovered. So this mathematical, even geometrical reading of the fold is at the essence in Terry of Chartres. It's part of Nicholas of Cusa's application, and Deleuze can't help himself ending up back down there. This is a passage in the fold, and just a few more slides here. This is the passage in the fold, the same Leibniz book, where he starts to apply it in his own new sense. Folding, unfolding, no longer simply means tension release, contraction dilation, but enveloping, developing. Unfolding is not the contrary of folding, but it follows the fold up to the following fold. Inflection is a virtuality that exists only in the soul that envelops it. Folds are in the soul and exist only in the soul. The whole world is a virtuality that currently exists in the folds of the soul, implementing inner pleats through which it endows itself with a representation of the world. He's on his own train leaving the station with his own ontology here, but this is a French post-structuralist, Nietzschean philosopher making great use out of the notion of the fold in 1988. It's really startling, and much more than I can think of any other Catholic or Christian, or for that matter, Platonist reception of Cusanus's ideas in the 20th century. Deleuze is way ahead of all of them. Okay. To conclude, 20 years into this quiet disagreement with Nicholas of Cusa, Deleuze is still attempting to extricate folding from the divine one. Nicholas of Cusa, the last Christian Neoplatonist interpreter of theological folding, before Bruno's, I would say, non-theological use, holds a special significance for Deleuze. But Nicholas held together a model of folding embraced by Deleuze, the concept. He held together that, but also the theological conclusions rejected by Deleuze. At the same moment, and with apparent ease. And Nicholas did so precisely through the mathematical aspect of the fold that Deleuze finds himself returning to time and time again, almost despite himself. So the aspect of folding, the mathematical side that Nicholas used to fuse the concept and the divine one, Deleuze wants to pull those apart. That's his project. But he keeps coming back to the mathematical aspect of it, which was the way that Nicholas brought them together. Deleuze claims that these latent zones of immanence appeared within the Cardinal's writings despite himself, and that readers like Deleuze could harvest those and read them against the grain through strategic deformation. And yet, if after 20 years of attempting this, Deleuzian folding ends up quite near where Cusanus began in De Docta Ignorantia, the credibility of that hermeneutic has to be called into question. Deleuze wrote 2 early books on Nietzsche, and across his works pursued a Nietzschean genealogical agenda to reverse Platonism. His brilliant but often tendentious readings of other philosophers are exercises in Nietzschean genealogy. Yet given what Deleuze learned and how much he learned about Christian, medieval, and Renaissance traditions from Maurice de Gondiac, he remains at the same time a surprisingly traditioned thinker. Not every French post-structuralist is citing Bonaventure and Eriugena and Meister Eckhart and Cusanus and Bruno and the 12th century, etc. That is, there is a tension in Deleuze between what Alistair MacIntyre calls rival versions of moral inquiry, genealogy on the one hand, and tradition on the other. And when this phenomenon in Deleuze jogged my memory, so I reopened that book, that great MacIntyre book, and it turns out, I had not recalled this, that MacIntyre singles out Gilles Deleuze as a case study for what happens when you appeal to the history of medieval philosophy and end up slipping from an attempted genealogical orientation into what MacIntyre calls tradition as an alternative. The problem facing the genealogist, according to MacIntyre, is the continuity and stability of the genealogist's own standpoint, even while the genealogist attempts to dissolve the standpoints of his opponents. For if a genealogist persistently succeeds in constructing robust alternative narratives, those then become stable alternatives, precisely as Deleuze did over 30 years. Stable alternatives whose very success offend against the genealogical orientation. This is MacIntyre's argument of why genealogy eventually will saw, if it succeeds, it will saw the ladder out from beneath its own feet. MacIntyre writes, if the genealogist is inescapably one who disowns part of his or her own past, then the genealogist's narrative presupposes enough of unity, continuity, and identity to make such a disowning possible. One central and acknowledged problem for the genealogist is that of how to deny what the theologian and the metaphysician assert without falling back into the very mode of utterance which the genealogist aspires to discredit. Oops. The concept of the fold, from Boethius to Teilhard to Nicholas of Cusa, is one such arc of tradition, I'm arguing. An arc of tradition that's broad enough at its base to resist genealogical pressures. That is, just when Deleuze thinks he is de-theologizing Cusanus's emanationist fold. In fact, he's only stepping closer and closer to Terrier-Chartres' model, a mathematical model of folding, and therefore entering only deeper, accidentally, into an essentially Cusan project of retrieving Terrier-Chartres' model of folding. So in trying to overcome Cusanus, he becomes Cusanus. When he wishes for a mathematized Neoplatonist emanation to better amplify immanence, Deleuze moves unwittingly not beyond folding in Nicholas of Cusa, but only deeper into its distinctive character, its Chartrian signature. Deleuze thinks he's altering the Cusan fold, but perhaps it was also altering him, as if he were caught inside the fold. Thank you for your attention.
I'm here. Thank you, David. I'm going to help facilitate some questions. I thought I saw a hand up already on somebody, or was it clapping? Maybe it was clapping. So anyway, so those of you who are on Zoom, you can use that hand raise function, and then I can know to pull you into the conversation. And anyone in the room, they're just going to actually raise their actual hand. So Elizabeth, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I haven't read any Deleuze, so I'm, asking a question out of complete ignorance. But I was really fascinated by one of the passage. You had a quotation up where there was this reference to a differentiator that relates the enfolding to the unfolding. If I got that right.
Yeah.
It was. Let's see.
It's in difference and repetition.
Yeah, difference and repetition. So the trinity of complication, explication, implication amounts to the totality of the system.
Yeah.
In other words, the chaos which contains all the divergent series which lead out and back in, and the differentiator which relates them to one another. And I mean, I was thinking in Cusa's system, right? That would be Christ. The gateway or the point or the juncture between enfolding and unfolding. Or at least that's like how I'm thinking about it. And I was wondering if Deleuze thinks about how he thinks about this differentiator, and if it functions as a kind of like maximum individual, where you have something like, I don't know, like the polygon, infinite-sided polygon and the circle converging.
Yes.
If it's that kind of, if it's a limit concept of some sort for him, or how is it for Liz? Is it using?
I'm doing my best in that passage too. I think in that text, and he doesn't use that in later text to my knowledge, but in that text in 68, the differentiator, he's trying to name what's the sort of granule of difference, numerically expressed or materially expressed. Is it the point? Is it the unit? Is it problems of measurement? Is it an atom? That's what he's talking about, the sort of minimal unit. But the point of that book is, and this is what makes him interesting, but also very difficult to think with, is he doesn't want to use point or unit or anything that's a concept of identity or sameness as the differentiator. But he has to name something that's common as a denominator to what is pure difference, what is similar in each of the cases of difference.
Yeah.
And this is what makes it a very difficult concept. But
okay.
But I think there he's referring to sort of, this is what I'm trying to define in the book. And he finds folding helpful because he can point to the kind of organic continuity of the fold, a spreading and extension, which isn't first a unit that multiplies other units. The continuity comes first. Maybe I keep going like this because it's space and motion are prior to the unit. So he's drawn, he never says that, but he's drawn to that. He does get into actually the concepts of space and Kant's notion of space later in the text, and he relates folding at that point as well.
Yeah.
I think actually here's another instance where he's closer to Nicholas of Cusa, however, because the notion of Christ as the sort of joint or intersection of procession and return is, I would say, more pronounced in Bonaventure. It's certainly there in Cusanus, but that's more classically Bonaventure. But in Nicholas, the question of the differentiator at kind of the unit level, that's where Nicholas finds unknowing. That's where negation comes in, where we can never get precise knowledge, and that sort of indefinability of the unfolding of numerical series that will never be perfectly precise because precision only lies with God. That's where Nicholas says, anywhere we look and measure in the cosmos, we come up against unknowing and ignorance. We come up against ultimately the mystery of God. So Nicholas is also thinking about the differentiator, but in that case, it probably is God as mystery. That's the differentiator.
Okay. Yeah, interesting.
I see Nancy's hand up. Nancy, please jump in. Oh, Nancy, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, there I am.
There we go.
I'm on the same track as Elizabeth, and thank you so much, David, for a beautiful, very, very interesting paper. I'm back to the fold in 1988, and back to this problem that if matter is points, infinitesimal points, not points, but rather linear. Where does a concept of chaos come in? Is a concept of chaos even possible with that line of reasoning? Because as soon as you have what is linear, then you have figurae, which are separated out from chaotic mass. I'm going back to Calcidius and chaotic mass, the Silva. And as soon as you separate out a lineality, a containment, and lineality, is that a word? Linear concept. You don't have mass any longer. So how does he skirt that?
Yes, that's a great question. So his argument is that in Leibniz, the fold univocally names both materiality and the soul, both matter and the soul, and that both do so not out of point or unit or part, but out of the priority of. And it's not so much linearity that fills in that ends that sentence there. It's not so much, it's not rectilinearity for sure. And it's not linearity in terms of being a pure abstraction that's a higher level of intelligibility or separation from the material. It's rather a name for, really, it's always curves before straight lines. Let me just read you some of the things that he refers to. If Descartes insisted on a rectilinear universe, Deleuze says Leibniz embraced a labyrinth of pleated matter, emblematized in Baroque aesthetics of marbled surfaces, irregular cavernous passages, porous substances, or fluid vapors. So it's sort of the fractal swirling of a trace of steam more than a line. But he calls those folds, and then he defines the fold in terms of lines. So I think there is a part that it's a good critique, but he's not himself focusing on that. He's interested in increasing and the fold of the non-differentiation of organic and inorganic. He goes into in detail. All of this happens in the first 12 pages of that book, if that interests you.
Thank you.
Chris Polito is in the room here.
So David, forgive me, I'm just a church historian. And I'm asking about categories that you discussed at the very end. And that is hearing whether genealogists don't need to go all the way through that process to collapse in on to themselves. What is tradition if nothing other than tracing genealogies, which will have continuities and discontinuities and side roads and things like that. So it could be that I'm misunderstanding the concept of genealogy, but it seems like from its very beginning, it is another word for tradition. That's
certainly, I take the point, and I think you're right that the common use of the term genealogy is more or less tantamount to tradition in MacIntyre's sense, who has a very, fluid and generous concept of tradition. A tradition is a series of conversations about what constitutes a tradition, Alistair MacIntyre. However, in the Nietzschean sense, genealogy exists to dissolve continuities. Genealogy is a method that begins with a continuity and then destroys it in order to not allow any sort of tradition to arise, because in Foucault's version of Nietzsche, this is at the end of Words and Things, Foucault says that's only possible relative to a hierarchical concept of God. If you have a notion of God above history, God as an author of history, then history produces coherent continuities from a historiographical perspective, and a historian is able to legitimately construct continuities, sources, influences, pathways. However, if God is dead, then no one should be able to do that any longer. So Foucault's use of genealogy to more, not so much as a sort of, sometimes ludic, sometimes insincere use by Nietzsche in the genealogy of morality, but in Foucault, it's sort of a historiographical principle that says, unless we are theologians, that's a big unless for MacIntyre, but unless we are theologians, we can't construct continuities out of history. All we can do is look at a series of isolated points. So I think that is something that's maybe just a tension in different possible senses of genealogy, some of which, as you outlined, could be fruitfully wedded to tradition, and then some of which means something very much opposed to that.
If I could just press, not you, but perhaps Nietzsche on this point, if we could talk about tradition outside the concept of religious tradition, outside the concept of God. We could talk about a tradition of Stoicism, for instance. We can make tracks which might take you through some religious thought. The concept of Stoicism is not dependent on a concept of a deity.
That's right, and at least MacIntyre's concept of tradition does not. That's a good point. I have to think about that more. You're right. MacIntyre's concept of tradition does not purport to be theologically grounded. It purports to be, grounded in the way that Aquinas supplements Aristotle is sort of the foundational instance for him. But he's thinking principally in terms of moral traditions and the kind of learning that comes through apprenticeship, and the kind of guidelines for morality that can come out of that communitarian perspective. But good point. There is a gap there between Foucault's use, and MacIntyre's talking about Foucault, but Foucault's critique of genealogy and MacIntyre's notion of tradition, that one is anti-theological and one is not necessarily theological. So there is a bit of a disjunction there. Thank you for that, Chris. That's thought-provoking.
Jerry.
David, expand this out a little bit for us more amateur techs. And maybe those on the screen can do the same thing. You found a wonderful example of how Nicholas of Cusa is influential on a modern philosopher. Give us some ideas about some of the other people, to your knowledge, who in the late 20th and now early 21st century are in dialogue with Cusanus as well. And is anything streamed as we think some of his concepts in political theory, for example, have been via the Concordancia and so on. But who else is in dialogue like this? It's very exciting, but are there others who would do the same?
Well, I'm glad you asked that. I'm editing a volume on that very project, and many of the people in the room are contributors, and their editor is late getting back to them, but it's in the works. This is part of a conference we had in the fall of 2019 in the before times, in person at Notre Dame, on the topic of the 20th and 21st century reception of Cusanus in modern philosophy and theology. And there's a range of explorations there, including some sort of live 21st century appropriations that we looked at. Papers from Falk, from David Bentley Hart. We had a contribution from John Milbank, who wasn't able to attend, but who submitted a paper for the volume. It's still an author to think with. The ones I mentioned are some of the most interesting, I think the most sort of robust of Certeau. And then today still Manuel Falk, who's written several times on Nicholas of Cusa, and Jean-Luc Marion, who's written on Cusa, and who in fact presented his paper in English first at one of our conferences at Kalamazoo a few years ago. So this is, what I like to tell people, this is to our fame, the American Cusana Society. Falk and Marion, Falk was Marion's student. Falk and Marion had deliberately avoided ever engaging each other in print, controversially or, citing each other. I'm not sure why, but that was a convention that they maintained. And they only first cited each other and disagreed over how to read De Visione Dei at the American Cusana Society conferences in successive years. So that's our little bit of philosophical history.
John Duclos.
Thank you, David, for a very good paper. In terms of Jerry Christensen's last question, I think we shouldn't really forget that you referred very briefly at the beginning to Germans. Cassirer,
Yes.
Gadamer.
Yes.
Gadamer are always honest in terms of the way they work out, not to them, not to. So there's that German hermeneutical, not only Kantian, but the German hermeneutical that reads them very closely and adapts. At that point, Gadamer, the notion of tradition,
Yes.
so on.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Let me intervene before you answer that question or address Don's point. Originally, David was to share this session with Michael Moore, who was unable to participate in the conference this year. Michael was going to give us a paper on Platonism in Weimar Renaissance. And of course, Michael is very interested in exactly the point Don just raised. It's unfortunate Michael's not able to be with us here, even virtually tonight. But David, even without Michael here, perhaps you want to address Don's point to some extent.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing, that Michael Moore has worked on that, and as part of his own contribution to that edited volume that's in the works that will be submitted to Catholic University of America Press shortly. But that's part of the project, and you're absolutely right. I think substantively that would be an interesting direction for me to keep thinking about Cusanus's status in our own receptions, and to what extent he kind of his writings, what should we say, incur a tradition effect in a Gadamerian way. So that's because of the breadth of his own reading and the authors that he brings with him, and the longevity of the continuities that he brings with him in his own writings, that to the extent that authors go beyond the surface in Nicholas of Cusa, they also kind of end up engaging a much longer tradition. And Don, that's an excellent point, that the place to think through that would very much include Gadamer's reception. But Michael would know more about that than I do. I wish he were here.
The other thing to add, and I see Sean's hand, so I'm going to turn it over to him in a second for his question. But the other thing to maybe add, or for you to develop a little bit more even now, if you want, would be this question of the extent to which the Deleuzian sort of ontological project is compatible or incompatible with a Gadamerian hermeneutic approach to history and thinking about the value or the meaningfulness of history. So I don't know if you want to elaborate any more, or
I would just say briefly that Deleuze wrote another book called "What is Philosophy?" He wrote it with that co-author, is later in his life one of the last books he wrote. And in that book, he praises Cusanus again for being a concept inventor. And Deleuze had a peculiar notion of philosophy that's quite radical, which I think is completely incompatible with any kind of Gadamerian or really any other aspect of tradition thinking. Because for Deleuze, the point of philosophy is not to seek truth, it is purely to invent concepts, like one makes chairs or makes a souffle. You make a concept. And then you look at it and you say, look at that concept. And maybe it has some political relevance, like his idea of pure difference coming out of 1968 and wanted to dethrone hierarchies. And so we can make those connections. But at least in his mature work, he just says there is no reference of the concepts, but the philosopher's job is a valuable one, just to create concepts. And he says, like Nicholas of Cusa, who actually is not a, Nicholas was inventing names of God. He thought they had referential value, but he does, unlike some other medieval Neoplatonists that we can think of, I think more than Eckhart, more than Bonaventure, for example, more than Areopagus, Nicholas produces a stream of newly invented names of God and wants to always craft a better one, and one that has this widget and one that does this also, non aliud and coincia oppositorum and all these different concepts that he comes up with. So Deleuze admires that, but in Deleuzean philosophy himself, it's much more of a kind of deflationary sense of what it means to access a tradition. And he's notorious for these deliberate, Nicholas misreads all the time accidentally, but Deleuze misreads all the time deliberately. Deliberate misreadings of authors' works in order to make what he wants with their ideas, concept making.
Fascinating. Sean, you have a question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I also wanted to say, in the wake of that reference to Michael Moore, that Michael and I both had the chance to read some of David's work on Deleuze, on Cusanus, and I think both of our minds melted as we read it in the best possible way, because it was so good, it was so complicated, but also the intellectual history component was so strong. Just tracing it back through Gandiak. I'm the type of person who's sort of drawn to read, continental receptions of figures like Cusanus, and I've read a lot of stuff that is kind of hazy and lazy. This is the opposite. This is so good. This is so well researched.
Thank you, Sean.
It was amazing. But so my question is, you kind of mentioned, I think Deleuze acknowledging via Gandiak this idea that Cusanus, and maybe just a broader legacy of Christian Neoplatonism as a whole, once you've studied it, is discernible in the German Romantics, right? And maybe a couple of the early 19th century German language authors. And so what I'm wondering is there a connection between that sort of Spinozan Nietzsche Deleuze angle, but Deleuze has the Gandiak sort of historical node feeding in as well? Is there a relationship between that intellectual trajectory and the kind of Werner Bayerwaltes, Douglas Hadley, kind of sort of in a different way, Cyril O'Regan, reading of German idealism and romanticism as a kind of post-Kantian rehearsal of Neoplatonic themes in a weird sort of way? Or are those, or should I conceive of those as two kind of rather different revivals of Neoplatonism in the modern era?
I think the author we're not mentioning is Heidegger. It's a question that what's the relationship between Deleuze's retrieval and a post-Heideggerian return to Neoplatonism that underlies so much of this ferment in late 20th century, early 21st century excitement about Neoplatonism and Marion and other people that you mentioned. Deleuze is wrestling with Heidegger in that first book, Difference in Repetition, because he's talking about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. And it's hard to think about Nietzsche and Kierkegaard without thinking about Heidegger. And he's writing in 68. He's very much trying to respond to Heidegger, but I think my sense, and I'm by no means read all of this stuff, and I haven't even finished those long books, but I think my sense is he leaves that problematic behind relatively early in his doctoral thesis in 68, and it's not something to which he returns. And he very quickly finds these early modern authors, very quickly at the same moment actually, so he sort of could have gone on this Heideggerian path, but instead it's Spinoza and Bruno and Leibniz that he gets excited about. So early modern non-Cartesians or post-Cartesians. And maybe there's some sort of a analogy of dealing with post-Heideggerian problems, but I don't think he goes back to that. But at the same time, a lot of the things that make him interesting, he has a whole philosophy of event. He has a whole argument with Alain Badiou over the one and the many. And they're sort of fighting to say who's the better Neoplatonist. It's very funny. Here in the 80s in Paris, people are fighting over who's a Platonist, who's not a Platonist, who's a better Platonist, what kind of Platonism. It's like, that is current in the late 80s, before Deleuze's death. He got ill and then died in the early 90s. And Alain Badiou is still riding that train about the one and the many, and he thinks Deleuze is sort of a crypto-Platonist of the wrong variety, and he's the better Platonist. So all that to say, there are these relevances and resonances between the Heideggerian problematic for Christian thought and the appeal of Neoplatonism. But I think that's exactly where to pick up a kind of constructive engagement of Deleuze is, why is he not doing that? Or, as I was trying to suggest, is he kind of inevitably doing that or accidentally doing that, as Badiou also suggests, that his theological project is much more conditioned by Platonism than it appears from the outside.
I have a question.
Thank you, Sean.
Good. Okay, Lee, I think we have time for maybe two more. So Lee, why don't you?
Yeah, I wondered what Platonism comes to mean in these kinds of conversations. I find it sort of a blanket word that remains fairly vague in my understanding. Do you have a way of trying to focus it and make it a little bit more understandable, maybe?
In the Spinoza book, chapter 11, when he gets into he reconstructs this narrative, he basically, you're right, he limits what Platonism means. He references the problem of the ideas and participation in the ideas, and the problem of the one and the many. And he doesn't discuss any sort of post-academic Middle Platonism or the genesis of Plotinus, but he just begins with Plotinus and says Plotinus resolves the problem of participation in the ideas through the cyclical movement of emanation and return. So that there's some means to coordinate the one and the many, not only in the ideas, but also through the cyclical movement. And he says Plotinus and Proclus over and over again. So it seems to be just descriptively for him, Platonism means the Neoplatonism of Plotinus and Proclus insofar as its emanation and return. And once he has that, he really focuses like a laser on what's at stake in the concept of emanation, to what extent does folding modify that or expose the secret reality of emanationism, that he thinks atheistic, that it sort of accidentally hits upon an atheist truth. Right. And therefore, that's the center of his interest. So Platonism is tantamount to emanationism for him.
Okay.
But Lee, you were asking I heard Lee asking not what is Deleuze's attitude to Platonism, but what's at stake even in saying there's a debate over who's the right sort of Platonist, and what does the term Platonism mean more generally. So in this case, you answered by saying, well, for Deleuze, Platonism means first and foremost emanationist ideas out of Plotinus and Proclus, but it might fully address Lee's question.
I didn't know my question was that full.
Well, I just misheard it, but I'm happy to.
I think that answer we'd have to look at, and I'm interested in this, and I've been writing about this as well, but about Alain Badiou's hermeneutic on the history of Platonism, which at the same time emphasizes the mathematical aspect extremely, to the extent of having, like Nicholas, mathematical diagrams in his own philosophical works. And yet at the same time is ahistorical and just says, I'm just reading Plato's Parmenides, and doesn't discuss the history of reception of that text and believes he has some sort of ahistorical access to that. He would say the reason he does is because of it's a mathematical Platonism that is to some extent ahistorical, and immediately accedes to the concepts of the one and the multiple through Cantorian set theory. That's his sort of take. It's a very peculiar enthusiasm about Platonism, but also a deliberate turning away from all the hermeneutical problems or opportunities that would induce one into. So Badiou's a strange case, but very relevant, very pertinent. He's still there. He's alive and writing about the one and the many, and it's very 21st century apparently. So take heart, American Cusana Society.
I'll take the privilege of asking the last question, this time for myself rather than to try and get a little bit more clarification about somebody else's. You've talked quite a bit about, we did the Gadamer, Deleuze, we did the Deleuze, which version of Platonism is the Platonism Deleuze is interested in. We've kind of danced around a variety of things. Spinoza's still on the table as somebody to come back to, right? I've heard it said, for instance, that Deleuze's best book on Spinoza is his Nietzsche book. I wish I could take credit for that, but it wasn't what I said. What you haven't really addressed, to my satisfaction, at least tonight, though I know it's in the paper, is this question of how strange the choice of Cusanus is for Deleuze, given the fascination with this emanationist line that's especially prominent in Spinoza, this monism, which would require a rejection of a certain variety of Platonism, right? Deleuze comes across as, he doesn't tend to use these sorts of words, but he comes across as a nominalist, as a function of his devotion to a radically monistic picture, and very, very much like Spinoza in that regard. So I can see the appeal of the methods, the conjectural method of Nicholas, of the concept generating method, of the terminology of folding, infolding, unfolding. But there still seems to be something really critically different and strange about the choice of a thinker who is also nevertheless fascinated with the transcendence of the divine, right, and a hierarchical relationship to the divine. Could you maybe close by saying a little bit about the strangeness of the Deleuzian choice in that regard, or whether you think that maybe
Spinoza.
Well, not Spinoza,
Yeah.
but the strangeness of the choice of Cusanus for radical eminence, or whether you think Cusanus himself has those resources there that are in tension with that more transcendent orientation.
Is your question, is Deleuze right that there are immanentizing forces inside Cusan philosophy?
No, I think he is. I think those are there.
Those are there.
I'm asking whether you find it odd that he would, to Cusanus.
I guess I don't find it. I guess I don't find it that odd. I mean, I think he finds in Cusanus, his real, governing spirit is Spinoza. He likes Duns Scotus because he says he has the same univocal ontology as Spinoza does. And he likes Cusanus because he thinks it has the same explication. Spinoza puts it in terms of expression more, hence expression in that book, as Spinoza does. And he likes, he's drawn to Nietzsche for similar reasons because of Spinoza's sort of atheistic or whatever that is, different kinds of senses of transcendence. But I'm not surprised about the Cusanus appeal, both because of that reason, but also if I can just grab one text here, also because of something else he says about mathematics. Deleuze writes in the preface to the Spinoza book, he's thinking about the more geometrico, the geometrical method in Spinoza, which is another sort of aspect that appeals to him. Because Deleuze studied with philosophies of mathematics and writes about mathematics, writes a lot about math. There's a whole edited volume on Deleuze and mathematics. It's extremely sophisticated math. Anyhow, he writes, if philosophy is amenable to mathematical treatment. This is because mathematics finds its usual limitations overcome in philosophy. No problem is posed by the application of a geometrical method to the absolute. Rather, does it there find the natural way to overcome the difficulties that beset it while applied to things of reason. In other words, I like Deleuze. I like that Spinoza also has this geometrical side, because mathematical problems find their solution in philosophy, and mathematical method can help philosophy along. Or as Nicholas of Cusa says, if something is true in mathematics, it must be all the more true in theology. De Theologicis Complementis, 1453. So that's a sort of another aspect we didn't get into as much here, but I'm interested in, and I'd like to do more work on. I just need to learn more about Deleuze's mathematics, but they both share this orientation toward thinking of number and line and space and figure as not just philosophically useful, but philosophically kind of optimized for thinking, as he says, the absolute.
Thank you, David. Will you all join me in thanking David for I had trouble with the notion that it was morning for some of us and afternoon for others and evening, but I think I can safely say for all of us here right now at this moment, have a wonderful evening, right? Even on the West Coast.
Even on the West Coast. Our sun is just setting. It's very good to be with you all. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person and I missed the festivities, but it's good to see you all and have a little virtual community as well.
Thank you very much. And we'll be back at this tomorrow all day. What's our first session tomorrow? 9 o'clock. Is that the working session?
No, it's Valerie.
Valerie.
Valerie, right, Valerie. Okay.
I'll be lecturing.
Valerie, very good. Okay.
Valerie from London.
Valerie from London. All right. We'll see you tomorrow.
Goodbye, everybody.
Good night.
Thanks for coming.